Hello, and welcome to lecture 3 of lesson 26, where we are going to conclude our discussion of Suetonius's life of Augustus. Now, one section of this life is sort of interesting because it seems to mark a sort of boundary. So in section 9, this is what Suetonius says: having given, as it were, a summary of his life, I shall now take up its various phases one by one, not in chronological order, but by classes, to make the account clearer and more intelligible. So the suggestion here is that he is moving from essentially the kind of biography we are more familiar with today, which is sort of the chronological one, to something that's quite different, which is sort of the categorical one. So now I offered you a sort of additional kind of outline of the life of Augustus. And one thing you can see on there is that, so here in 9, he sort of makes a switch, and then he will talk about sort of different wars, both internal and foreign wars. Then he will talk about the constitution, social and religious affairs, political reforms, public spectacles. So these are the kind of categories that we are talking about in terms of what is included in a usual life of an emperor in Suetonius. One aspect of that's sort of super interesting is that increasingly, after Augustus becomes sort of this model emperor, there develops a language that we could consider sort of a language around virtues. And so we know that already under Augustus, the source of this was imperial propaganda. And I think I mentioned in the last class about the golden shield that Augustus received, which was displayed in a meeting hall of the Curia, which had on there words that are in Latin, but that you yourself can very easily translate into English: virtus, pietas, clementia, justitia, suggesting these are, of course, virtue words that we took from the Latin into English. And so virtue, piety, clemency, and justice would be sort of key virtues that Augustus liked to claim for himself. And so this kind of virtue language increasingly under the empire becomes part of the political legitimization of emperors. And one other way in which this is also very critical is that it will become part of what is panegyric, which is the praising of a living person. And so what you're essentially trying to do, I think, is a good way to understand why panegyric, sort of this kind of praise of an emperor, is so important, is that when you say to the emperor, "Oh, emperor, your clemency is just amazing. You're so famous for that. You're so wonderful." What you're trying to do is trying to essentially force the emperor to practice the clemency, right? So the idea is that you would sort of essentially twist his arm. "Oh, if you want to look good, then this is what you should be doing." And so one part of this is sort of one more keyword is sort of exemplariness, right? Sort of this is how the language will teach us about Augustus being a model, is that we will get this sort of exemplary nature of the right kind of emperor. And in fact, Suetonius's biographies will be structured through such catalogs of virtues and vices as a measure, as a litmus test, if you wish, of deciding whether someone is a good emperor or a bad emperor. And I promise you, you will have lots of bad emperors, so we'll have a lot of fun with that. But the way this works is that there are a set of virtues and a set of vices, and the good emperor has all the virtues and none of the vices, and the bad emperor has all the vices and none of the virtues. Now, the truth is sadly never black and white, right? So we will in fact see that most emperors have stuff from both sides. But nevertheless, this sort of becomes a little bit of an instant categorization of things. And one of the things that we can see that I sort of wanted to model this with today is to think about, in particular, some building activities and like sort of the social and religious affairs category first. And so what you see there is that, for example, in section 28, there is this famous saying that since the city was not adorned as the dignity of the empire demanded and was exposed to flood and fire, he so beautified it that he could justly boast that he had found it built of brick and left it in marble. Right, this famous saying associated with Augustus: "I built so much for this city that it is now was once built of brick, but is now built of marble. He also made it safe too for the future, so far as human foresight could provide for this, meaning floods and fires. He was trying to protect against those. In 29, we get more about sort of buildings and many public works, in particular the following: his forum, we already heard about this and we will hear more, with the Temple of Mars the Avenger, the Temple of Apollo on the Palatine, and the Temple of Jupiter, the Thunderer on the Capitol, right? So we see sort of lots of building activities as one big way for an emperor to make a claim to fame, with the idea being, so for example, when you read the description in 29 later on about the forum, what you see is that it's supposed to be sort of not just representational space, but also incredibly helpful for the community. So for example, the forum will serve as a place where legal cases can be heard. So the idea is, and then he built a space in which legal cases could be heard. So finally, law and justice returns. Similarly, another such matter is sort of benefactions. And a prime example for an emperor to do benefactions is to provide entertainment. So in the case of Augustus in 43, section 43, we read, he surpassed all his predecessors in the frequency, variety, and magnificence of his public shows. He says that he gave games 4 times in his own name and 23 trams for other magistrates who were either away from Rome or lacked the means. So this is really interesting because it suggests that he paid for games, let's count it, a total of 27 times, but that he only put his name on the games 4 times, suggesting that he was not selfish about the benefit that one could gain from such benefaction to the people. He gave them sometimes in all the wards and on many stages with actors in all languages and combats of gladiators, not only in the forum or the amphitheater, but in the circus and in the septus all over the place. Sometimes, however, he gave nothing except a fight with wild beasts. So it's interesting, we get sort of a range of these benefactions. So what's important here is that when you get these stories, right? So here we are in the buildings, or in 43 to 45 sort of public spectacles, and even earlier sort of generosity and moderation, but also in section 40, I chose not to sort of excerpt that, but when he talks about sort of food provided for people, that we see that sort of it sets up a model for how to be a good emperor. This is sort of, there's almost like these categories, boxes, little boxes that he has to tick to be a good emperor, and this is how you do it. So that is something that both emerges with the rule of Augustus, but then it almost becomes like sort of part of the system. And the idea is usually that, the emperor does all this for you. But I think the full story is that the emperor does all this for you. And of course, that forum where the cases are going to be heard is going to be a place that represents his power, or similarly, the games that he's going to give you will be entertainment, probably fad, but it also means that his fame, he will be the big benefactor, and so it benefits him. But sort of this mutual benefaction is a good way of thinking about it. One last bit that's always interesting in the lives of Augustus is a sort of odd preoccupation with discussing the details of how famous emperor died. Now, many people, many descendants of Augustus, in fact, will not die peaceful death, but Augustus himself did. And it's worth reading sort of the story we get about it in Augustus. So we are in the year 14 CE now. So on the last day of his life, he asked every now and then whether there was any disturbance without on his account. Then calling for a mirror, he had his hair combed and his falling jaw set straight, right? He's clearly aging and sort of falling apart. So he's trying to look good. And after that, calling in his friends and asking whether it seemed to them that he had played the comedy of life fitly, he added the tag, "Since, well, I have played my part, all clap your hands, and from the stage, dismiss me with applause." So this is a sort of famous last words category, which is collected about various emperors. You might already know Julius Caesar's famous last word, which was also "you, my son Brutus." So we get these sort of stories about, what the famous last words were. And I think it's kind of striking that Augustus would choose a sort of acting metaphor, that he acted, sort of he filled a role, and that he wants acknowledgement that he did that particularly well, maybe somewhat narcissistically, but definitely sort of an idea of himself that he did a good job of what was expected of him. And so then there's a little bit more that we find out about his final moments. He sent them all off, all his friends who would just ask to clap. And while he was asking some newcomers from the city about the daughter of Drusus, who was ill, he suddenly passed away as he was kissing Livia, his wife, uttering these last words: "Live mindful of our padlock, Livia, and farewell," and thus blessed with an easy death, and such a one as he had always longed for. And so the idea is also ultimately is that Augustus, in his sort of divine and infinite wisdom, was aware of that time that was coming, right? Like he invites tries to look good, he invites the friends in, he has the famous last word for them, then he has the famous last word for Livia, and then he is passing away. So it sort of completes the life and gives us a sense of his sort of exit on plan. I think in summary, what we can say about Suetonius' life of Augustus is that it's an incredibly rich source for our understanding of the life of Augustus, but also for the developing grammar of imperial rule in ancient Rome. And this is what Augustus was such a key figure in, and what we see absolutely at work in the works of Suetonius. Sometimes little things slip in. We find out the little propaganda words of Antony or some other details that sort of don't quite fit the picture, but nevertheless, the language is already there, and we can see what makes a good emperor and what makes an emperor bad. And that language is about to stay. That's it for lesson 26. Thank you.